It was a peaceful afternoon in the small, quiet town where 82-year-old Margaret lived. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were chirping in the trees. Margaret had just finished her daily cup of tea and was tending to her garden, which she loved more than anything else. She carefully pruned the roses, ensuring every flower bloomed as beautifully as possible. For years, this had been her routine, a calm, simple life. She enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with living alone in her cozy home at the end of the street. But today was different. As Margaret bent down to water her flowers, she heard footsteps approaching from the driveway. At first, she thought it might be her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, coming to borrow something again. But when she looked up, she saw a small boy walking toward her, someone she didn't recognize. The boy looked to be about 8 years old. His messy brown hair stuck out in every direction, and he wore a faded t-shirt and jeans that looked too big for him. He wasn't smiling. In fact, his face looked serious, almost worried. He held something in his hands, wrapped up in what seemed like an old dusty cloth. Margaret couldn't tell what it was, but she could see that he was carrying it carefully, like it was something important. "Hello, dear," Margaret called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I do for you?" The boy stopped in front of her, looking up at her with big, curious eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just held out the small bundle in his hands. "I found this," he said finally, his voice soft but shaky. "In the woods behind my house. I thought maybe you'd know what it is. It looks important." Margaret, surprised by the strange request, took a step forward. She didn't know what this child was doing here or why he was offering her such an odd item, but she didn't want to be rude. She gave him a friendly smile, trying to reassure him. "Well, that's very thoughtful of you, young man," she said kindly. "I'll take a look at it. Why don't you come inside for a moment while I open it?" The boy hesitated, looking uncertain. He glanced down at the bundle, then back at Margaret. His hands were trembling slightly, and his eyes darted around, as if he wasn't quite sure if it was safe to be there. But then he nodded and followed her into the house. Margaret led him through the back door into the kitchen, where she always felt most comfortable. The smell of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air from earlier in the morning, and the sun streamed through the windows, making the room feel warm and inviting. She asked him to sit at the kitchen table while she carefully placed the bundle on the counter. The boy sat down quietly, his eyes glued to the small package, his fingers playing nervously with the sleeves of his shirt. Margaret reached for the cloth and gently started to unwrap it. The moment the bundle was fully opened, her fingers froze. Inside the cloth was a small old shoebox. Nothing special at first glance, but it was the box itself that caught Margaret's attention. It was worn, the edges of the cardboard torn and stained with what appeared to be dirt and age. Timmy, the boy, looked up at her, his face filled with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. "I didn't want to touch it much," he said quietly, "because I think it's not supposed to be there." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The boy's words made her feel uneasy, and a shiver ran down her spine. What had this boy found, and why had he brought it to her? "Let's see what's inside," Margaret said, trying to stay calm. But deep down, something told her that this wasn't just some lost item. Carefully, she lifted the lid of the shoebox. The moment she did, she felt a cold draft fill the room, and a feeling of unease washed over her. Inside the box, there were several items, but one thing stood out: a small, odd-looking object wrapped in a cloth. It seemed heavy for its size, and the way it felt in her hands made her stomach tighten. "Timmy," Margaret said, her voice suddenly serious, "where exactly did you find this box?" The boy shrugged, his eyes wide. "It was buried in the woods, under some old leaves. I just dug it up." Margaret stared at the box, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. Margaret sat still for a moment, staring at the old shoebox in front of her. Her hands trembled as she held the object wrapped in cloth, its weight strange for something so small. She glanced over at Timmy, who was still sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his eyes wide with uncertainty. She could tell he wasn't sure what to think, but the look on his face told her that he, too, felt something was wrong. "Are you sure you found this in the woods?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice calm. She didn't want to scare the boy, but she had to know more. The fact that Timmy had found the box buried in the woods made her uneasy. Why would something like this be hidden away, so far from the neighborhood? Timmy nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was playing with my dog, and we went off the trail. I saw the box half buried under some leaves, so I dug it up. I didn't know what it was, but it just looked important. I thought maybe you could help me figure it out." Margaret studied the boy, wondering if he had any idea what kind of trouble he might have stumbled upon. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that sometimes things were better left alone. But it was too late for that now. Timmy had already brought the box inside, and whatever was in it needed to be dealt with. Margaret slowly unwrapped the cloth, feeling a chill run down her spine. As the last layer of fabric fell away, she saw what was inside: a small, tarnished knife. The handle was covered in strange symbols, and the blade itself looked old, like it had been left to rust for many years. There were dark stains along the blade, but Margaret couldn't tell if they were rust or something else. The sight of it made her stomach turn. Timmy gasped when he saw the knife. "What is that? Is it dangerous?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She picked up the knife carefully, turning it over in her hands. The weight of it felt off, almost wrong. It wasn't like any knife she had ever seen. The symbols on the handle were strange, like nothing she recognized. She had a sinking feeling in her gut, a feeling she couldn't ignore. Something about this knife didn't belong here. It felt dangerous. She gently placed the knife back in the box and closed it, her mind racing. What could this be? Why was it hidden in the woods? And why had Timmy found it? "Well, Timmy," Margaret said after a long pause, "I think we need to call someone. This isn't something we should handle on our own." Timmy looked confused. "Call who?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I think we should call the police. They'll know what to do with it. This is no ordinary knife." The boy's eyes grew even wider. "You think it's a weapon?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm not sure, but it might be. We need to be careful." Timmy bit his lip nervously. "I didn't mean to get you into trouble. I didn't know it was bad. I just thought it looked interesting." Margaret smiled at him, trying to reassure him. "You didn't know, Timmy. You're just a boy who found something strange. But we need to be smart now." She reached for the phone on the counter, her hands still shaking a little. As she dialed the number for the police, her mind was filled with questions. What was this knife used for? Was it part of something bigger? And who had left it buried in the woods? She couldn't help but wonder if Timmy's discovery was just the beginning of something more dangerous. The phone rang 3 times before the dispatcher answered. Margaret quickly explained the situation, trying to stay calm. "Hello, I'm Margaret Turner, and I need help. A young boy found an old box in the woods, and inside there's a knife with strange symbols. It doesn't look safe. I think it might be dangerous." The dispatcher remained calm and professional. "Stay where you are, Mrs. Turner. We'll send an officer right away. Do not touch anything else in the box. Just stay calm and keep the boy with you." Margaret hung up the phone and looked over at Timmy. "The police are on their way. They'll take care of everything now." Timmy nodded but still looked scared. "What will happen to the knife? Will they take it?" "Yes," Margaret said softly, trying to reassure him. "They'll take it and figure out what to do with it. It's better that we don't touch it anymore." Timmy stayed quiet, his eyes still fixed on the box. He seemed to be deep in thought, his mind racing with questions. Margaret couldn't blame him. She, too, was wondering what would happen next. What if this was just the beginning of something much bigger? The minutes felt like hours as Margaret waited for the police to arrive. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes on the shoebox that held the knife. Every now and then, she glanced at Timmy, who sat across from her, nervously fidgeting with his hands. The silence in the room felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Timmy hadn't said much since they called the police. He kept looking at the box, and Margaret could see that his mind was racing, just like hers. What had he found? Why had this strange object ended up in the woods? And what was its true purpose? Margaret tried to stay calm, but it was hard. The knife in that box was unlike anything she'd ever seen before. The symbols carved into the handle looked ancient, like something from a different time or place. The bloodstains on the blade only made the situation worse. Even though the police hadn't arrived yet, she could already feel the weight of what they were about to face. As the minutes dragged on, Margaret's thoughts began to race. What if this knife wasn't just an old relic? What if it had something to do with a crime? Maybe it had been used in a robbery or a violent act. She had heard stories in the news about strange, unsolved cases in the town, things that didn't add up. Could this be connected to something bigger? Something more dangerous? She glanced over at Timmy, whose face looked pale. "Are you all right, Timmy?" she asked softly. Timmy nodded, but he didn't meet her eyes. I don't know. I didn't mean to find it. I thought it was just a box, you know. But now it feels scary." Margaret smiled gently at him, trying to ease his fear. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just found something. We'll figure this out together." Timmy's eyes flickered to the box again. But what if it's dangerous? What if someone's looking for it? Margaret didn't have an answer for him. Deep down, she shared his fear. The thought that someone might be looking for the knife sent a shiver down her spine. Who would bury something like this in the woods? And why? It didn't make sense. Just then, Margaret heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over her, and she stood up, her heart pounding. The police were finally here. She could hear the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house. Within seconds, 2 officers knocked at the door. "Mrs. Turner." One of the officers, a tall man with a calm expression, asked when she opened the door. "We got your call. Is this the box you mentioned?" Margaret nodded and stepped aside to let them in. "Yes, it's in the kitchen. The boy found it in the woods." The officer followed Margaret into the kitchen, his partner right behind him. They both looked at the shoebox on the table with a mix of curiosity and concern. Margaret could tell that they took this seriously. "Where did you find this?" the second officer asked Timmy, who was still sitting at the table, looking nervous. "In the woods," Timmy said, his voice shaky. "It was buried under some leaves." The officers exchanged glances, and the first one carefully picked up the box, examining it. He lifted the lid, his eyes narrowing when he saw the knife inside. "This is unusual," he muttered under his breath. "Where exactly in the woods did you find this?" Timmy pointed toward the edge of the neighborhood. "It was near the old oak tree, about a quarter-mile from my house." The officers nodded. "All right, we'll take it from here," the first officer said. "We'll need to collect some information about where you found it, Timmy, and make sure we get everything documented properly." "Mrs. Turner, you did the right thing by calling us." Margaret felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a growing sense of unease. She had hoped the police would solve this mystery, but now that they were here, the situation felt more real than ever. What was going to happen next? Was this just an old knife, or was there something more to it? As the officers continued to examine the box, Margaret watched them closely, her mind racing with questions. Why had Timmy found it? And who else might be looking for it? The room was filled with the quiet rustle of the officers' movements as they carefully took the knife and the box into evidence bags. The entire time, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. When they were done, the officers turned to Margaret and Timmy. "We're going to take this in for further investigation," the first officer said. "We'll keep you updated as soon as we know more. For now, you both should stay inside. We'll make sure the area is safe." Timmy nodded, but he still seemed uneasy. Margaret gave him a reassuring smile, though inside she was just as worried. As the officers left with the box, she couldn't help but feel that the peaceful life she had always known was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next few days felt like they stretched on forever for Margaret. The police had taken the box with the knife, but every time she thought about it, she felt a growing sense of unease. She had never imagined her peaceful life would be interrupted like this. After all, Margaret had lived in the same neighborhood for over 40 years. Nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. But now, everything felt different. Every time she went outside to water her flowers or sit on her porch, her eyes kept wandering toward the woods where Timmy had found the box. What else was hidden out there? Was it possible that there were more dangerous objects buried in the forest, just waiting to be discovered? The thought made her stomach twist. The police had promised to keep her updated, but so far, they hadn't called. Margaret tried not to let her imagination run wild, but it was hard. The knife, with its strange symbols and dark stains, seemed to have a life of its own in her mind. It wasn't just an old relic. It was something more. She could feel it. And the longer she waited, the more she felt that something wasn't quite right. One afternoon, after returning from a quick trip to the grocery store, Margaret was surprised to find a police officer waiting at her door. It wasn't one of the officers who had come to her house before, but he wore the same uniform. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Turner," the officer said, offering her a polite smile. "I'm Officer Thompson. I'm here to give you an update on the box you found." Margaret stepped back to let him inside, her mind racing. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready for what he might say. "Please, have a seat," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair at the kitchen table. She could feel the tension in her shoulders as she sat down, waiting for the officer to speak. Officer Thompson sat down across from her and set a folder on the table. His face was serious, and Margaret noticed a slight frown on his lips. He looked like he had something important to tell her. "We've completed our initial investigation on the knife you found," he said, opening the folder. "And I'll be honest, Mrs. Turner, this is a bit more complicated than we originally thought." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The officer looked up at her, his expression grim. "We traced the symbols on the knife to a local group that's been linked to some unusual activities in the area. Nothing criminal, but we're still trying to piece it all together." Margaret felt her heart drop. A local group. That didn't sound good. She didn't know much about secret organizations or strange activities, but something about the way the officer spoke made her uneasy. "Unusual activities," Margaret repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "What kind of activities?" "Nothing violent, as far as we can tell," Officer Thompson replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But the group seems to be connected to some old traditions. We're still researching what they might be after, but we believe this knife might be part of some sort of ritual or ceremony. It's not a typical weapon, but its purpose is still unclear." Margaret's mind raced. A ritual. A ceremony. What kind of group was involved in something like this? She felt her thoughts spinning in circles. The knife was more than just a simple object. It was part of something much bigger. But what was that something? And what did it mean for her and Timmy? "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "What do they want with this knife? And why would Timmy find it?" "We're not sure yet," Officer Thompson admitted, leaning forward. "It's possible that Timmy didn't know what he was finding. The group might not even know that their knife has been taken. But we're going to continue investigating the matter and see if we can find out more about this group." Margaret tried to process everything the officer was saying. The idea of a local group involved in mysterious activities was unsettling, to say the least. She had always thought of her neighborhood as quiet and safe, a place where nothing ever really happened. But now, it felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "I just want to know that everything's all right," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to put Timmy or anyone else in danger. Officer Thompson nodded. We'll make sure nothing happens. But for now, it's best if you keep this quiet. We don't want to cause any unnecessary panic. Just stay alert and let us handle things. Margaret nodded, though she didn't feel as reassured as she wanted to. The officer stood up, closing the folder with a soft click. Days passed, but the unease in Margaret's heart didn't fade. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, even in her own home. The neighborhood, once so peaceful and quiet, now felt like it was hiding secrets. Every rustling tree or distant voice seemed suspicious. It wasn't just the knife anymore. It was everything around her. Was there something bigger going on? Timmy had been quiet ever since the officer's visit. He still played outside with his dog, but his eyes always seemed to scan the surroundings, as though he was looking for something. Margaret didn't want to scare him, but she couldn't help feeling that the boy might be in more danger than anyone realized. She had tried to keep him busy with little distractions, baking cookies or taking walks, but she could tell his mind was elsewhere. One afternoon, as Margaret was sitting on her porch, she noticed a car pulling up in front of Timmy's house. It wasn't the usual family car, and it wasn't anyone she recognized. The car was sleek, black, and shiny, and it didn't quite fit in with the other vehicles on the street. The driver, a man dressed in a dark suit, stepped out, walking quickly toward the front door of Timmy's house. Margaret's curiosity got the best of her. She tried to act casual, but she couldn't help staring, her heart suddenly racing. Who was this man? Why was he visiting Timmy? She watched as the man knocked on the door, and within seconds, Timmy's mother opened it. The two exchanged a few words, and though Margaret couldn't hear them from across the street, the body language spoke volumes. The man seemed serious, his posture rigid. Timmy's mother nodded, her face full of concern, and stepped aside to let him in. Margaret leaned back in her chair, trying to look nonchalant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was this man connected to the strange events? Could he be part of the group the officer had mentioned? 1,000 questions raced through her mind. She had to know what was going on, but she didn't want to get involved more than she already had. Still, the unknown pulled at her. She couldn't ignore it. As the man entered Timmy's house, Margaret got up, her instincts pushing her forward. She felt a sudden urge to do something, anything, before it was too late. With a deep breath, she walked down her porch steps, trying to keep a low profile as she crossed the street. When she reached Timmy's yard, she hesitated, glancing toward the window where she had seen the man enter. She could see shadows moving inside, but nothing clearly. The door was closed, and the house was quiet. Margaret's mind raced, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just wait for answers to come. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets were buried in that woods and connected to the knife, it was all linked to Timmy. She had to protect him, somehow. Turning toward the side of Timmy's house, Margaret noticed an old tree with thick branches hanging over the back fence. The thought came to her suddenly. She could climb up and peek through the window from the back. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only option she had. She carefully made her way to the tree, hoping nobody would see her. Her fingers wrapped around the rough bark, and she slowly pulled herself up, heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the second branch, she paused, taking a deep breath. From here, she had a view of Timmy's living room window. She carefully inched forward, trying to stay quiet. Through the glass, she could see the man talking to Timmy's mother. She wasn't sure what they were saying, but the tension in the room was thick. Timmy's mother seemed to be nervous, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone else. Margaret could feel her heart pounding. This wasn't a normal visit. There was something off about this man and the way he was interacting with Timmy's family. Suddenly, the man turned toward the door. Margaret froze, holding her breath. The man stepped out of the house, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Margaret quickly turned her head, pressing herself against the tree. Her heart raced, but she dared not move. She waited, holding perfectly still. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly turned back and peeked over her shoulder. The man was getting into the black car again, and this time he drove away without looking back. Margaret exhaled in relief, but she knew one thing for sure. The situation was far from over. She slowly climbed back down the tree, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't keep watching from the shadows. She had to talk to Timmy's mother to find out what was going on. Whatever it was bigger than she had ever imagined. With a final glance toward the street, Margaret hurried back to her house, her mind racing with questions and fears about what was coming next. The next morning, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her mind was still spinning from the events of the day before, the mysterious man in the black car, the tension in Timmy's house, and the strange knife. She had tried to distract herself with her usual morning routine, but every time she passed the window, her eyes would instinctively search Timmy's house across the street. The visit from the man was still fresh in her mind. By mid-afternoon, Margaret decided that she couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. She had to speak to Timmy's mother, Mary, and find out what was really going on. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that people often kept things to themselves. But this was different. The man in the suit, the strange behavior, she could sense that something was wrong. Taking the deep breath, Margaret grabbed her purse and stepped outside. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the quiet street. Timmy was outside, playing with his dog in the front yard, but Margaret didn't approach him. It was Mary she needed to talk to. She walked over to Timmy's house and knocked gently on the front door. After a few moments, the door creaked open and Mary appeared. Her eyes looked tired, and there was a faint crease of worry on her forehead. "Hello, Margaret." Mary greeted her with a forced smile, but Margaret could tell it didn't reach her eyes. "How's your day going?" "Not too bad," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice casual. "I was hoping we could talk for a moment. Is everything all right here? You seem a little tense." Mary's smile faltered for a second, and Margaret noticed her glance toward the street, as if making sure no one was watching. She hesitated before opening the door wider, motioning for Margaret to come in. "Please come inside," Mary said quietly. Margaret stepped in, feeling the heaviness in the air. The house was the same as it had always been. Cozy, warm, filled with little trinkets and family photos, but there was an underlying tension that Margaret couldn't ignore. Mary led her to the living room, where they both sat on the couch. Timmy was still outside, his attention on his dog, so for now, they were alone. Margaret felt her heart race a little, but she pushed through. She needed to know the truth. "Mary, I know something's going on," Margaret began, her voice gentle but firm. "Yesterday, I saw a man visit your house. He looked serious. Was he involved in something? I'm worried, and I just want to help." Mary's eyes widened slightly, and she looked down at her hands in her lap, visibly uncomfortable. She hesitated before answering, her voice low. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. "I was hoping to keep it quiet, but I guess you have a right to know, especially after everything that's been happening." Margaret sat forward, her heart pounding. "What's going on, Mary? What's all this about?" Mary took a deep breath and finally spoke, her words heavy with concern. "That man, his name is Mr. Carter. He's from a group. They'd been keeping an eye on things in the area for a while now. I didn't want to get involved, but Timmy found something he shouldn't have." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process what Mary was saying. "What did he find?" "The knife," Mary replied, her voice shaking slightly. "It's not just any knife. It's part of a ritual, a ceremony. That group, they've been searching for it for years. I didn't know what to do when Timmy brought it home. I never thought it would lead to this." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. A ritual, but why would Timmy find it? How did he even end up with it? "I don't know," Mary answered, her voice tight. "He was just out in the woods, playing like he always does. He didn't know what he was picking up. But that knife, it's tied to something much bigger than us. That man, Mr. Carter, he works for a group that believes the knife has power. Power to unlock something. To change things. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. This was all so much to take in. So what does this group want? What happens if they get their hands on the knife? Mary shook her head, looking almost fearful. I'm not sure, but I know they'll stop at nothing to get it back. They think it holds the key to some kind of ancient power. They'll do anything to find it. Margaret felt a wave of dread wash over her. The peaceful neighborhood she had known for so many years now seemed like a dangerous place. She glanced toward the window, her thoughts racing. Is Timmy in danger? She asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Mary admitted, her voice breaking. I've tried to keep him safe, but I'm scared. If they find out he has the knife, they might come after him. Margaret and Mary sat in the living room, both filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The weight of their conversation hung in the air, but Margaret knew they couldn't wait any longer. Whatever this group was after, they needed to stop them before Timmy or anyone else got hurt. Mary's hands trembled as she held a cup of tea, her eyes wide with worry. What do we do now? If they come for Timmy? I don't even know where to hide him. I can't let anything happen to my son. Margaret placed a hand gently on Mary's arm. We'll figure something out. But first, we need to keep that knife hidden. It's the key to all of this. And if they find it, they'll come straight for Timmy. Mary nodded, her face pale. You're right. But where can we hide it? I can't risk them finding it in our house. And I don't want Timmy to get involved anymore. He's too young for something like this. Margaret thought for a moment. She could feel the urgency in the air, the pressure of time running out. We need to get the knife out of here. It's too dangerous. What if we put it somewhere safe, somewhere they'd never think to look? Mary's eyes brightened slightly. Where? We can't just leave it somewhere obvious. It has to be a place where no one will find it, especially them. Margaret looked out the window at the quiet street, her thoughts turning. The neighborhood, peaceful as it was, held hidden corners that only a few people knew about. The woods, the old barn at the edge of the property, there were places that no one ever went to. And the more she thought about it, the more one place seemed like the perfect hiding spot. I know just the place, Margaret said, her voice steady. There's a spot in the woods behind the old barn. It's hidden from the road and from the houses. No one goes there anymore. Mary looked at her, her face filled with relief. That could work. But we'll need to make sure no one sees us when we go. We'll do it at night, Margaret suggested. It'll be dark, and we can take the knife, hide it, and leave before anyone even knows we were there. Mary looked hesitant, but nodded. Okay, it's risky, but it's our only option. That night, as the sun began to set, and the neighborhood fell into a peaceful quiet, Margaret and Mary prepared to carry out their plan. They moved quietly through the house, gathering what they needed. A flashlight, a small bag to carry the knife, and a coat to blend into the night. Timmy's asleep, Mary whispered, glancing toward the stairs. We have to be quick. Margaret nodded. We will be. They crept out the door, their footsteps soft on the grass. The night was chilly, and the air felt thick with tension. The two women moved quickly down the street, their eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. When they reached the edge of the woods, they slowed down, careful not to make a sound. Margaret led the way, guiding Mary through the familiar path she had used for years. The trees were dense, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, making the woods feel darker than usual. Margaret knew the way well. She had spent many quiet afternoons there when she was younger, but tonight, the woods felt different, almost alive with the threat of danger. They reached the barn, an old weathered building that no one had used for years. It stood in the middle of a clearing, hidden by the surrounding trees. Margaret pulled open the creaky door, the sound echoing through the silence. Inside, the air was musty, and the floor was covered with dust and old hay. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Mary asked, her voice tight with worry. "I'm sure," Margaret replied, her voice low. "No one ever comes here. This is the safest place to hide it." They quickly moved to the back of the barn, where a pile of old wood and crates were stacked. Margaret knew there was a hollow space behind them, a perfect hiding spot. She placed the bag with a knife inside the space and carefully covered it with the wood and debris. It was out of sight, and anyone who might come here wouldn't be able to find it easily. "Done," Margaret whispered, stepping back. "It's hidden. Now we just have to get back." Mary breathed a sigh of relief, but her face was still itched with worry. "I hope this works, but we need to be careful. They could be watching us." Margaret nodded. "I know. Let's get back to the house, stay quiet, and wait for things to calm down." They left the barn, moving swiftly back through the woods. The tension between them was palpable, but they both knew they had done the right thing. The knife was hidden now, but they still had no idea what the group would do next. Margaret's mind raced as she thought about the dangers still lurking around them. The next few days were filled with tension. Margaret couldn't relax, even for a moment. Every time a car drove by or someone knocked at the door, her heart raced. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, worried that someone from the mysterious group might be watching. Timmy seemed oblivious to the danger, playing outside like any other boy. But Margaret knew that things were far from normal. Mary had kept the knife hidden in the barn, just as they had planned. No one suspected a thing. At least, that's what they thought. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the group wouldn't give up so easily. They had already shown how far they were willing to go to find it. On the 5th day after hiding the knife, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. It was early in the morning when the knock came. She opened the door to find Officer Daniels standing on her porch, looking serious. "Morning, Mrs. Miller." He greeted her with a polite smile, but his eyes quickly scanned the area, as though making sure no one was around. "Can I have a word with you?" Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Of course, officer. What's going on?" Officer Daniels glanced behind him before stepping inside. He lowered his voice as he spoke. "We've been getting reports of strange activity around the neighborhood. Cars driving by late at night. Unfamiliar people asking about the Miller house. I wanted to check in with you." Margaret's mind raced. The last thing she wanted was to drag Timmy's name into this, but she had to stay calm. "I haven't seen anything unusual, officer," she said, trying to sound as relaxed as possible. "The neighborhood's been pretty quiet, just like always." Officer Daniels nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made Margaret uneasy. "That's good to hear. But I need to ask you something more specific. Do you know anyone by the name of Mr. Carter?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Carter, the man who had visited Mary's house, the man from the group who was after the knife. She had to think quickly. "No, I don't think so," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Is he someone local?" "He's not," Officer Daniels replied, frowning. "He's part of a private group. We've had a few reports of people asking around about a specific item. I don't know the details, but I think it might be connected to some illegal activity." Margaret's mind spun. It was happening. The group was getting closer. She had to protect Timmy, and she had to do it fast. Officer Daniels looked at her carefully, his tone turning serious. "I'm going to ask you to keep an eye out. If you see anything suspicious, report it immediately. And if you get any visits from people like Mr. Carter, don't hesitate to call me. We might be dealing with something bigger than we thought." Margaret nodded, trying to hide her fear. "I will, officer. Thank you for the warning." As Officer Daniels left, Margaret's mind was racing. It was only a matter of time before the group found out that the knife was gone. She couldn't keep hiding it forever. And now, with the officer involved, she had no idea who could be trusted. That evening, as darkness fell over the neighborhood, Margaret met with Mary again. They sat in the kitchen, talking in hushed voices, trying to come up with a plan. The pressure was building, and Margaret could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. "We can't keep this up much longer," Mary said, her voice trembling. "What if they come for Timmy? I can't lose him." Margaret placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "We won't let that happen. We just need to think of a way to stop them before it gets worse." As they talked, a loud knock came at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Mary, and they both stood up, silently moving toward the door. Timmy was in his room, thankfully unaware of the danger. Margaret opened the door cautiously. Standing on the porch was a man in a dark suit, his face partially hidden by the shadows. He looked familiar. It was Mr. Carter. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "We know you have it." Margaret's blood ran cold. It was exactly what she had feared. The group had found out. She stepped back, trying to keep the door between them. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have anything." Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. We know you've hidden the knife, and we know you'll do anything to protect it, but it's not yours to keep." Margaret's mind raced. She had to buy time. "I don't know anything about a knife," she said, her voice shaking. "You've got the wrong person." Mr. Carter's expression hardened. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "I don't think you understand the situation. This isn't a request. We're giving you one last chance to hand it over." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced over her shoulder at Mary, who stood frozen, her face pale with fear.